The icy Maine air stung Sam Smith's face as he stepped out of his truck, his breath rising in frosty plumes. He pulled his jacket tighter, glancing around the snow-covered clearing. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, their tall pines heavy with fresh snowfall. A frozen lake gleamed through the trees, its surface a smooth sheet of ice reflecting the pale winter sun. Sam had driven up from Boulder a few days ago, hoping for some solitude and good fishing. Boulder was a bustling town in the shadows of the Rockies, where the winters were cold but invigorating, and the summers brought tourists in droves. Fishing had been his father's favorite pastime, a passion Sam had picked up over the years. This trip, though, was less about fishing and more about getting away from the stress of city life. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. Sam spent the mornings drilling holes in the ice and dropping his lines, his small portable heater keeping him warm as he waited for a bite. The afternoons were spent exploring the woods, his boots crunching through the snow as he marveled at the quiet beauty of the landscape. At night, he sat by his campfire, the orange flames casting flickering shadows across the trees. It was during one of those nights that the calm shattered. The sun had set hours ago, and the fire crackled softly as Sam poked at it with a stick. The stillness of the Maine wilderness was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of tree branches under the weight of snow. But then, a new sound emerged, subtle at first, like the faint rustling of leaves. Sam paused, his hand tightening around the stick. He scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but there was nothing to see. Just the woods, endless and silent. The sound came again, louder this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, crunching through the snow. "Hello?" Sam called out, his voice firm but wary. No answer. Then he saw them. 2 pinpoints of light, faint but unmistakable, staring at him from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal he knew. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared unerringly in his direction. A chill ran down his spine, unrelated to the cold. He had read stories, accounts of strange creatures sighted in the remote woods of New England. Most were dismissed as myths or exaggerations, but now, staring into those unblinking eyes, Sam felt the weight of those tales pressing down on him. The fire sputtered, and the darkness seemed to creep closer. Sam stood, his heart hammering in his chest. The eyes vanished, and for a moment he thought he had imagined the whole thing. But then the footsteps returned, faster this time, circling the camp. He grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. Suddenly, something massive barreled into him from the side, knocking him to the ground. The flashlight went flying, its beam spinning wildly before landing in the snow. He caught a glimpse of the creature, its form shrouded in shadow, long limbs, and a face that seemed to shift and blur, as if it didn't belong to this world. It grabbed him with an unnatural strength, dragging him through the snow despite his struggles. Sam yelled, kicking and clawing at the thing's grip, but it was like fighting against iron. The creature dragged him into the deeper woods, far from the fire and the safety of his camp. When it finally stopped, it dropped him unceremoniously in a small, snow-covered clearing. Then it vanished, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. Sam sat up, shaking and disoriented. His hands were raw from the cold, and his heart raced in his chest. He had no idea where he was or how far he had been dragged. The woods loomed around him, silent and oppressive. He built a small fire with trembling hands, using the lighter he always carried in his pocket. The flickering flames brought some comfort, but the fear lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching him, its eyes hidden in the darkness. As he huddled by the fire, his thoughts drifted to his family. He thought of his mother's warm smile, his brother's teasing jokes during their family fishing trips. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. The night was endless, every sound amplified by his fear. At one point, he thought he saw the creature's eyes again, glinting faintly in the firelight, but they disappeared before he could be sure. When dawn finally broke, he wasted no time. Extinguishing the fire, he started walking, using the rising sun to guide him eastward. The snow was deep, and every step was an effort, but he didn't dare stop. After what felt like hours, he heard the faint hum of a car engine. Hope surged through him, and he pushed himself forward, breaking through the tree line onto the main road. A pickup truck was approaching, its driver slamming on the brakes as Sam stumbled into the road. The man behind the wheel rolled down the window, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Need a ride?" he asked. Sam nodded, too exhausted to speak. He climbed into the truck, grateful for the warmth of the cab. "What happened to you?" the driver asked as they pulled away. Sam hesitated, glancing back at the woods. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said finally. When they reached the nearest town, Sam called the police. He told them about the creature, about being dragged through the woods, but their skeptical looks made it clear they didn't believe him. Back in Boulder, Sam tried to put the experience behind him, but the scars, both physical and mental, remained. He stopped going on solo trips, sticking instead to the familiar waters near home. The Maine woods, with their silent trees and unblinking eyes, were a place he would never return to. The snow crunched under Chuck Russell's boots as he trudged up the trail, his breath misting in the frigid air. The Appalachian woods stretched in every direction, their skeletal trees covered in a fresh layer of powder. Chuck adjusted his scarf and looked over his shoulder at the three friends following him, Matt, Sarah, and Ian. All of them were bundled up, their faces red from the cold but glowing with the exhilaration of the hike. Chuck had always loved the outdoors. Growing up in Lawrence, Kansas, he had spent most of his childhood exploring the wide-open prairies and wooded trails outside town. Lawrence was a quiet place, steeped in history, and Chuck's family had roots there going back generations. But the rugged beauty of the Appalachian Mountains was something entirely different, wild, untamed, and brimming with mystery. The group had started early that morning, eager to make the most of the short winter daylight. The snowy trail meandered through dense woods, occasionally opening up to breathtaking views of the valleys below. They had packed light, just snacks, water, and a small emergency kit, planning to finish the hike and be back at their cabin by evening. By midday, the snow had picked up, falling in soft flakes that muted every sound except the crunch of their boots. They stopped in a small clearing to rest and warm their hands by a fire Ian quickly built. The warmth was a welcome reprieve from the biting cold, and they huddled close, laughing and sharing stories. Chuck found himself thinking about his younger brother, Danny, who had always been his partner on hikes back home. Danny was the jokester of the family, the one who could make even the toughest climbs feel fun. Chuck felt a pang of longing, wishing his brother could have joined them on this trip. The peaceful moment was broken by a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The group froze, their laughter fading as they exchanged uneasy glances. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just the wind," Matt said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the dark woods. Chuck didn't say anything. He had heard stories about strange sightings in the Appalachian wilderness, tales of creatures that defied explanation. He had always dismissed them as folklore, the kind of thing locals told to spook tourists. But now, with that growl echoing in his ears, he wasn't sure. They doused the fire and decided to keep moving, sticking closer together as they continued up the trail. The woods felt different now, the once beautiful snow-covered trees looming like silent sentinels. Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the snap of a branch somewhere off to their left. Chuck's heart pounded as he scanned the trees, but all he could see was an endless expanse of white and gray. "Let's pick up the pace," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. They hadn't gone far when the creature appeared. It stepped out from the shadows, its massive form covered in matted fur, its yellow eyes glowing with a predatory light. It looked like a wolf, but its size and the way it moved on two legs marked it as something else entirely, something unnatural. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl, then charged. "Run!" Chuck shouted, shoving Sarah ahead of him as the group bolted down the trail. The snow made running difficult, their boots slipping and sliding as they tried to put distance between themselves and the beast. Chuck heard a scream behind him and turned to see Ian on the ground, the creature looming over him. He wanted to help, but Matt grabbed his arm, dragging him forward. "We can't stop!" Matt yelled, his face pale with terror. They ran blindly, the sound of the creature's snarls fading but not disappearing. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Sarah was crying, and Matt was clutching his side, gasping for air. "We have to get to the main road," Chuck said, his voice firm. "It's our only chance." The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that blurred their vision and coated the trail. They moved as quickly as they could, but the silence of the woods was oppressive, every sound amplified by their fear. Chuck kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see the creature charging toward them. The group stumbled onto the main road just as the last light of day was fading. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance and they waved frantically, relief washing over them as the car slowed to a stop. The driver, an older man in a worn jacket, rolled down his window. "What happened to you folks?" Chuck hesitated, glancing back at the woods. "We were attacked," he said simply. "Can you take us into town?" The man nodded, and they piled into the car, looking at the warmth of the heater feeling almost surreal after the icy terror of the woods. They didn't call the police. What could they say? That a creature out of legend had killed their friend? Even Chuck wasn't sure what they had seen. But as they drove away, he couldn't help but glance back at the darkened trees, wondering if those glowing yellow eyes were still watching. The snow fell in light, lazy flakes, softening the barren expanse of Arizona's high desert. Arnold Winchester tugged his jacket tighter, cursing under his breath as he stared at the open hood of his car. Steam hissed from the engine, a cruel reminder of his bad luck. This stretch of road was supposed to be a shortcut to Sedona, a scenic route past pine forests and red rock cliffs. Instead, it had become a dead end. Arnold was no stranger to adversity. Growing up in Chicago, he'd learned to navigate icy streets and brutal winters. His father, a mechanic who ran a small garage on the city's south side, had taught him how to handle just about any automotive problem. But out here, miles from the nearest town, even his skills couldn't help. The radiator was cracked and the engine was as good as toast. He pulled his phone from his pocket, only to see "no service" glaring back at him. That, at least, wasn't a surprise. He was deep in the Kaibab Plateau, surrounded by snow-covered pines and rocky outcroppings. The area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional sigh of the wind. It reminded him of winters in Chicago when Lake Michigan would freeze over, turning the shoreline into a ghostly expanse of ice and fog. Arnold grabbed his pack from the back seat and started walking, hoping to find help before nightfall. He knew there was a small village marked on his map about 5 miles south. If he was lucky, he could make it before the temperature plummeted. The woods closed in around him, the tall pines swaying gently in the wind. The snow made every sound sharper, the crunch of his boots echoing like gunshots. He tried to distract himself, thinking about his mother's Sunday dinners, the way she could whip up a feast that made even the coldest Chicago nights feel warm. He missed that, missed the simple comfort of home. About an hour into his trek, he heard it. A low, guttural grunt that stopped him in his tracks. Arnold turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd heard stories about strange things in the woods. Growing up, he devoured tales of cryptids and unexplained phenomena, stories of creatures that defied logic. Bigfoot was a favorite subject, though Arnold had always chalked it up to overactive imaginations and clever hoaxes. Now, standing in the snowy silence with the hair on the back of his neck standing up, he wasn't so sure. He pressed on, quickening his pace. The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching impossibly long. Then he saw it, or thought he did. A massive figure moved between the trees, too fast and too large to be a deer. Arnold stopped, his heart hammering as he stared into the gloom. The figure was gone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The grunts turned into growls, low and rumbling, coming from somewhere behind him. Arnold broke into a run, his breath puffing out in white clouds as he zigzagged through the trees. He didn't stop until he stumbled into a small clearing, collapsing against a fallen log. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with his lighter, managing to coax a small flame into life. He fed it kindling until the fire roared, casting long shadows across the snow. Sitting there, he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. It couldn't be real. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, amplifying his fear of being stranded in the wilderness. He thought of his sister, who always teased him about his love of spooky stories. She'd laugh if she knew he was out here, jumping at shadows. The thought brought a fleeting smile, but it faded quickly. The growls returned, louder now, and Arnold realized they were circling the clearing. He grabbed a branch from the fire, holding it like a torch as he backed away. The creature stepped into the light, and Arnold's blood ran cold. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in matted brown fur. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight with an unnatural intelligence. Arnold had seen bears before, but this was no bear. Its proportions were wrong. Its arms too long, its posture eerily human. The creature let out a deafening roar, and Arnold knew he was out of options. He ran, the firebrand still clutched in his hand, the creature crashing through the woods behind him. Branches tore at his clothes, and the cold air burned his lungs, but he didn't stop. He followed the slope downhill, hoping it would lead him to the road. The snow was deeper here, making every step an effort. He could hear the creature gaining on him, its guttural snarls cutting through the night. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, the forest thinned, and he saw the faint glow of streetlights ahead. Arnold burst onto the road, waving his arms frantically as a pair of headlights approached. The car skidded to a stop, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a bewildered expression, threw open the door. "Get in!" the man shouted. Arnold didn't need to be told twice. He dove into the passenger seat, like slamming the door just as the creature emerged from the trees. The driver hit the gas, and the car sped away, leaving the monstrous figure behind. Neither of them spoke until they reached the village, the warm glow of its windows a stark contrast to the darkness they'd left behind. Arnold thanked the driver and staggered into a small diner where the smell of coffee and fried food brought tears to his eyes. He didn't call the police. What could he say? That he'd been chased by Bigfoot? Instead, he sat in the corner booth staring out at the snowy night, trying to convince himself it had all been a nightmare. But deep down, he knew better. He'd seen the impossible, and it had seen him too.